guarantee of performance, creating a deferral of obligation option and extension of performance guarantees with the developer's agreement, and Chapter 9 subdivision design policies allowing for the deferral of drainage studies and authorizing the city engineer as their approval authority.
Thank you. John James, Director of Planning and Development Services. As you just read, this does a lot of things. This came to you all back in June. You tabled it. You looked at it again in July, tabled it again. In the meantime, we've had meetings with interested parties from the development community. And as I'll get to, I believe there's only one area of disagreement. So it's fairly well summarized in the memo, all of the changes. I'm going to go through some of them fairly briefly. If you have questions on them or something that I don't address, feel free to ask me. But again, based on our meetings, I believe that there's just the one element that is of disagreement. And so I'll touch on that one first. And that's the issue of when a preliminary plat should expire. We currently don't have any expiration, so we could have a preliminary plat that might have been approved 50 years ago, and if a developer came forward today, we would be obligated to approve a final plat under that old preliminary plat. We're very unique in terms of not having an expiration, and so as we started through this amendment process, we looked at our peer cities, and you'll see in your background information that all of our peer cities have expirations. Most of them are 1, 2, 3, and in that ballpark. As you know, we originally recommended a 3-year expiration. Again, that's pretty consistent with Midland, Odessa, Abilene, Wichita Falls, Lubbock, all of those cities. We got some pushback from the development community, and that's part of what resulted in this being tabled. And then they ultimately came back with a suggestion of 10 years. Again, we think that's a little too long. And so we're supporting a 5-year as a compromise, I think. I wouldn't say that's a compromise that we've all agreed to because they're still asking for the 10 years, but we're willing to go to a 5-year as an attempt at a compromise. I'll point out, here's just some of those cities, as I mentioned. I will point out one thing that was changed, you'll see in the ordinance. To be consistent with state law, we reworded part of that section on preliminary plat expiration to ensure that any progress towards implementation of that preliminary plat extends it. So if the expiration is 5 years, if they come in with a final plat for a portion of that preliminary plat, when that final plat's approved, even if it's 4 years in, it automatically extends it, resets the clock to another 5 years. And you'll see there were some changes in state law recently, and we made our ordinance consistent with that to define what progress towards completion is. And it's not only a final plat, but it could include spending funds to install streets or water lines or certain things like that. Costs incurred as part of the project. And so basically the idea is if you've got a preliminary plat and you're moving forward and you do something substantial within that 5-year period, your time would extend out another 5 years. But if you haven't done anything, haven't done any development, haven't put any water lines in the ground, then once the 5 years is up, it expires. You can always bring it back for another approval of a preliminary plat, but it can't just stay out there indefinitely. So before I move on, are there any questions on that particular piece? Again, I'm not going to go through all of these. The ordinance does deal with splitting and combining lots and clarifying that language. We have consistently required, if you're taking 2 lots and combining them, you have to replat that. You have to do it through a replat. It's not clear in the definitions of our ordinance. All of the terms refer to dividing land. And so it's not clear that combining land actually requires that. Again, we view that as a cleanup because that's what we've been requiring already. It expands the exemption if you're building across a property line. Right now, if I own 2 lots, I can put a house across the property line without having to replat. This expands that to 3 adjacent lots for that exception. some cleanup, and this change to exempt small single-family residential. That was a request from the development community. We cleaned up the definitions. Again, this is not a substantive change. We already define in the ordinance what constitutes a subdivision. We basically put that language twice, so we just took it out of one location and left it in the other location. This is another example where we've increased the time periods for an administrative plat. Instead of expiring in 6 months, now they'll expire in 12 months. We also, with final plats, you had 18 months to complete it, but it could be extended for 18 months. We just went the full 3 years so that you developer didn't have to go through that extension process. This is the preliminary plat that I've already talked about, but just changing it to a expiration of 5 years, as I mentioned. Talked a little bit about deferrals. We've done some of those. This adds some provisions in the ordinance to make clear that you all have the ability to defer certain improvements beyond. There's some parts of the ordinance, basically your authority is to either approve it or deny it. You don't have the authority to defer it to some later date. This writes into the ordinance that ability for you all to do those deferrals. It also allows for a development agreement. Right now, a developer who say they don't want to put in the roads now, but they want to put them as they develop, right now they have to put up actual cash or a letter of credit. This would allow them in certain circumstances to do that through a developer agreement. They basically sign a promise to do it without having to put up the letter of credit. I do want to say that in most circumstances, they would still have to put up the cash or letter of credit, but this gives us the opportunity to allow that developer agreement in certain unique situations. Similarly with the drainage study, this would allow a drainage study to be authorized to be deferred, which technically isn't written into the ordinance today.
Yeah, I want to clarify something on that. So we have a preliminary plat for a large tract of land, and they come in to develop, let's say, 5% of the tract. Is the drainage study required for the entire tract?
I'd defer that to, well, engineering. On the drainage, it's a little simpler, at least from our perspective, because the city has a separate drainage ordinance that outlines all of that, what's required and when. So they already, through the drainage standards, have some more flexibility than we might have for water, sewer, and roads. I don't know if maybe Russell knows the answer to that question. If the answer is that they have to do a drainage plan for the full preliminary plat area, that's at the discretion of the city engineer. Is that, do you do a preliminary plat on, drainage plan on a preliminary? Okay. So again, the whole purpose of this is to allow even more flexibility than what we already have.
Okay.
This in no way increases the requirements for a drainage plan. I think that's it. Yeah, again, staff does recommend approval as presented here. And again, unless I missed something from our meetings with the development community, I believe that preliminary plat expiration timeframe was the only area of disagreement that was left after these months of revisions.
We got all this in our packets on Thursday. I would like to, I know we've tabled it twice. I have not had enough time to really look at it and go through it the way I'd like to before I vote on it. So I would like to table it one more time. Give us ample time to study this and know what we're voting on and not just voting on something.
I think we'd be comfortable with that if that's your direction. I will point out that we highlighted in yellow the changes from last time. So from June and July of last year, the only things that have changed are those yellow highlights. And so I think that normally we would get you something like this a little more in advance. But since the actual changes from the last time you saw this were so minimal, we felt comfortable moving ahead and getting it to you last week. Again, we're fine if you want to table it, but if you do that, as you review it, really focus on those highlighted portions. But again, our recommendation is to go ahead and approve it today, but that's up to you all.
Okay. I'm going to take public comment, just simply because it looks like Mr. Gully would like to speak.
Thank you for indulging me. I appreciate that. And this is just kind of an additional thought, discussion, kind of as we've gone through some plats. And it correlates, and I tried to catch the engineering guys. They had to get to a meeting on their way out. Here lately, we've been doing a lot of commercial replats and plats, and we've been asking for deferral of water and sewer services. And we've been kind of dealing with this on and off for years and years and years. And so a lot of the commercial development here lately seems like it occurs in areas that already has development around it and water and sewer mains in place, or we're doing new stuff in. And one of the requirements is, just because it's straight out of the development ordinance, is to install water and sewer services. For commercial development, a lot of times you don't know what's going in there. You may have an idea, you may know what's going in there, but you're not going to know what size water or sewer main it's going to need, and not main, but service, and where that service line would best be suited for that site. So we always ask for those to be deferred. And so I don't know if there's a way we could add some sort of deferral mechanism or something, so we're not coming up here every time and asking, as part of all of the conditions, to defer water and sewer services. And that's something maybe engineering said they would be fine with that, but you know, now if we're going to have an extra month to review it, we could get them to weigh in and have some verbiage to present possibly next time for the water and sewer service deferral for commercial property only. We're not referring to residential. We know what they need most times. This is only for commercial.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to speak on this?